Hey, what's going on, everybody? So look, today I want to talk about something that's got me pretty hyped and, honestly, a little nervous at the same time. Because when Netflix announces a big budget war movie, we all know it can go one of two ways. Either something absolutely incredible or, well, something we'd rather not discuss. But this time, it looks like they're actually going for it. And I'm talking about War Machine, the film dropping on Netflix in 2026. And yeah, I already know what you're thinking. Another war movie? What makes this one special? Well, sit back and get comfortable because we're going to break down everything we know so far. And trust me, there's plenty to unpack here. First off, let's put things in perspective. When we're talking about war films, we're talking about a genre that's given us absolute masterpieces of cinema. From Apocalypse Now to Saving Private Ryan, through Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, The Hurt Locker, and so many others that have defined entire generations. So when someone decides to make a war movie, they already know the bar is set ridiculously high. You can't show up with something mediocre because you're going to get compared to the best of the best. And that's exactly what makes this Netflix project interesting. They seem ready to compete in the major leagues. Now, the first thing that catches your attention about War Machine 2026 is the approach they're taking. We're not talking about a movie that simply glorifies warfare or throws explosions at you every 5 minutes to keep you glued to the screen. No, this goes in a different direction. From what's leaked so far, the film aims to explore the complexities of the modern military machine, that massive structure that moves entire nations and often operates on logic that escapes the common sense of any normal person. And I find that fascinating because it's territory that few films have truly explored. Think about it for a second. Most war movies we watch focus on the soldier in the battlefield, in the trenches, in the moment of combat. And that's perfectly fine because that's where the drama is, where the tension lives, where humanity exists in its rawest state. But what happens behind the scenes? What goes on in those operations rooms where decisions are made that will affect thousands of lives? What about the generals who have to play political games while trying to win a war? That's the gray zone War Machine seems determined to explore. And honestly, it's a minefield, pun intended, that can yield extraordinary results if handled properly. Speaking of handling things properly, let's talk about the team behind this production. Because Netflix doesn't mess around when they decide to go all in on a project. They've brought in people with experience in these kinds of narratives. Folks who understand that a war movie isn't just about the war itself, but about the people who live through it, suffer through it, and in many cases, cause it. The director they've chosen for this project has a track record that speaks for itself. Someone who's proven they can handle complex stories without losing the audience along the way. And that's crucial because when you're dealing with military bureaucracy, international politics, and combat strategy, it's very easy to get lost in a sea of jargon and technical details that bore even the most interested viewer. But here's where it gets interesting. The movie doesn't just stay in the technical weeds. What really gives this project its power is the human element. Because at the end of the day, behind every military strategy, behind every order, behind every decision made in an operations room, there are people. People with families, with fears, with ambitions, with contradictions. And that's what War Machine promises to show. the humanity, or lack thereof, within the war machine. Let's talk a bit about the plot without getting into heavy spoilers because I don't want to ruin the experience for anyone. What we know is that the story centers on a contemporary military conflict, one that echoes real situations we've seen in the news over recent years. And I really like that because it gives the film a relevance that goes beyond entertainment. It's not just a fictional story you watch and forget. It's something that makes you think about the real world, about the wars being fought right now while we're sitting here watching videos on the internet. The protagonist is a high-ranking military officer who finds himself in an impossible position. On one hand, he's got pressure from his superiors who want quick, visible results, something they can show at press conferences that justifies the multi-million-dollar operation. On the other hand, he's got the reality on the ground, which is far more complicated than any strategic plan can anticipate. And in the middle of all that, he has to deal with his own convictions, what he believes is right versus what the system demands he do. It's a brutal internal conflict, and if the actor portraying him manages to convey all that complexity, we could be looking at a memorable performance. And speaking of performances, the cast they've assembled for this movie is top tier. I won't name everyone because the list is long, but let me tell you, when you see the names involved, you'll understand why there's so much anticipation around this project. These are actors who've proven time and time again they can carry a film on their shoulders, who can make a character feel real, three-dimensional, human. And in a movie like this, where characters are as important as the action, having a cast like that is half the battle won. But let's not fool ourselves. Having great actors doesn't guarantee a great movie. We've seen productions with stellar casts that end up being disasters because the script doesn't work, the direction is weak, or the editing ruins everything. So let's talk about the screenplay, which is where a good movie really gets cooked. What's known about War Machine's script is that it's gone through several revisions, which can be a good or bad sign depending on how you look at it. On one hand, it means they've taken time to polish the story, to make sure every scene has a purpose, that every line of dialogue contributes something. On the other hand, too many revisions can mean they weren't sure what story they wanted to tell, which can result in a film that feels inconsistent. However, from what's leaked about the script, the final version appears to be solid. The dialogue has that touch of realism this kind of movie needs, that mix of military jargon, dark humor, and moments of vulnerability that make the characters feel like real people rather than action movie stereotypes. And that's something to appreciate because one of the most common problems with modern war films is that characters end up being caricatures. The tough general, the idealistic soldier, the corrupt politician. War Machine seems to avoid that trap by giving each character layers and nuances that make them interesting. Now, I want to talk about something I think is fundamental and often overlooked when we discuss war movies, the political context. Because a film like War Machine doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's releasing at a time when the world is more turbulent than ever, with active conflicts in various regions of the planet, with geopolitical tensions that remind us of eras we thought were behind us. And in that context, a movie that critically examines the military machine has an impact that goes beyond the cinematic. It's a social commentary, a reflection on who we are as a society, and how we got to this point. And I know some will say, it's just a movie. Don't read so much into it. But that's where I disagree. The best war films in history have been precisely the ones that went beyond entertainment, the ones that used cinema as a tool to question, to provoke, to make the viewer leave the theater, or in this case, close Netflix, with more questions than answers. Apocalypse Now wasn't just a movie about Vietnam. It was an exploration of human madness. Full Metal Jacket wasn't just about military training. It was about dehumanization. And War Machine has the potential to be that kind of film, one that transcends the genre and becomes something bigger. But hey, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. There's still time until release, and many things can change. What I can tell you is that, based on what we know so far, there are plenty of reasons to be excited. And there are also reasons to be cautious, because Netflix has a mixed track record with these kinds of ambitious productions. Sometimes they nail it. Think about All Quiet on the Western Front, which was spectacular. And sometimes they fall short. So let's keep expectations at a healthy middle ground and wait to see the final result. That said, I want to dive a bit deeper into the production details because there are technical aspects worth mentioning. First, the cinematography. It's been confirmed that the film was shot on real locations, not just in studios with green screens. And that makes a difference, believe me. When a war movie is filmed in locations that resemble the actual conflict setting, the immersion is completely different. You can feel the desert heat, the dust in the air, the vastness of the landscape. It's not the same as a digital background, no matter how advanced the technology is. There's something in the texture of reality that no special effect can replicate. The director of photography they've hired for this project is someone who's worked on visually stunning productions, and their work on War Machine promises to be among the best we've seen in a recent war film. They've talked in interviews about their approach to capturing both the grandeur and the intimacy of war, that constant duality between wide panoramic shots that show the scale of conflict and close-ups that capture characters' emotions. It's a difficult balance to achieve, but when done right, the result is cinema at its highest level. And speaking of technical aspects, I can't skip over the sound design, because in a war movie, sound is as important as the image, if not more so. The roar of helicopters, the thunder of explosions, the whistle of bullets, that terrifying silence that comes after combat. All of that contributes to creating a sensory experience that pulls you fully into the story. And from what's been said, War Machine's sound team has done exceptional work. They've recorded real sounds from weapons and military equipment, mixed them with original compositions, and created a soundscape that, according to those who've seen early test screenings, is absolutely immersive. The score also deserves separate mention. They brought in a composer who knows exactly how to use music to enhance emotions without falling into cheap manipulation. We're not talking about those generic soundtracks that sound like any other action movie. Here, there's musical work that complements the narrative, underscores important moments without being intrusive, knows when to fall silent and let the images speak for themselves. Because sometimes silence is more powerful than any symphony, especially in a war movie. Look, I know I'm getting into very technical territory, but these details are what separate a good movie from a great one. Anyone can film an explosion, but creating a coherent visual language that reinforces the narrative and enriches the viewer's experience. That's real cinema. And War Machine seems to be made by people who understand that. Let's talk now about something lighter, because not everything has to be serious and deep. I want to discuss the humor in the movie, because from what's leaked, War Machine has genuinely funny moments. And I'm not talking about forced jokes or cheap comic relief. I'm talking about organic humor that naturally emerges from situations and characters. There's a scene, for example, where a group of soldiers is arguing about the food at the base. One of them is convinced the chicken they serve is actually some other animal disguised as chicken. I don't even want to imagine what. And the discussion keeps escalating to absurd levels while explosions echo in the background. It's the kind of humor that only works in a war context, because the contrast between the trivial nature of the discussion and the gravity of the situation is what creates the comedy. And that kind of humor is incredibly realistic. Anyone who's talked to military veterans knows that humor is a fundamental survival tool. When you live in a situation where death is a constant possibility, laughter becomes the last line of defense against madness. And War Machine understands that, incorporating this humor as an organic part of the military experience rather than as an external narrative device. Another funny moment, according to the leaks, involves a video conference between the protagonist and a politician who clearly has no clue what's happening on the ground. The disconnect between field reality and the perception from the Capitol is so vast it becomes comedic, although at the same time deeply concerning. And that combination of humor and concern is exactly the tone War Machine seems to be going for. You laugh, but you laugh with a discomfort that makes you think. You know what I love about this approach? It respects the viewer's intelligence. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It presents the situation and lets you reach your own conclusions. If you want to laugh, you can laugh. If you want to be outraged, you can be outraged. If you want to do both at the same time, you can do that too. And that emotional ambiguity is one of the hallmarks of quality cinema. Moving on to another topic, I want to discuss the music, not the composed score, but the diegetic music, what plays within the world of the film. Because the songs characters listen to, the music coming from vehicle speakers, the melodies someone hums while cleaning their weapon, all of that contributes to creating a specific atmosphere and defining character traits. In War Machine, from what's leaked, the musical selection is eclectic and sometimes surprising. There's classic rock, hip-hop, country, even local music from the region where the conflict takes place. And each musical choice has a purpose. Sometimes it establishes a scene's mood. Sometimes it ironically contrasts with what we're seeing. Sometimes it simply reminds us that soldiers are people with tastes and preferences, not uniformed automatons. There's a particular scene where a soldier is listening to a cheerful, catchy pop song while patrolling a potentially dangerous zone. The contrast between the lightness of the music and the tension of the situation is almost surreal, and it works as a reminder of how absurd day-to-day life in a war zone can be. One moment, you're a normal young person listening to pop music. The next, you're a soldier who has to make life or death decisions. And that juxtaposition, that coexistence of the mundane and the extraordinary, is one of the things that makes War Machine feel genuine. Now let's get into a topic I know is controversial: gender representation in war films. Traditionally, war movies have been an almost exclusively male domain, both in front of and behind the camera. Women, when they appear, are usually relegated to secondary roles: the wife waiting at home, the nurse caring for the wounded, the reporter covering the conflict. And while those are legitimate roles worthy of being told, they represent only a fraction of women's experience in war. War Machine seems to take a more inclusive approach in this regard. There are female military personnel in operational roles, not as tokens or exceptions, but as integral parts of the team. There are civilian women who aren't simply victims, but active agents in their own stories. And there is, according to reports, a female perspective that enriches the overall narrative by offering a viewpoint that war movies rarely explore. This doesn't mean the movie is woke or that it sacrifices realism for inclusion. That false dichotomy some folks on the internet love so much. It simply means the film acknowledges a reality that war cinema has ignored for too long, that women are there, that they participate in conflicts in multiple ways, and that their stories deserve to be told as much as men's. And if that bothers someone, well, maybe the problem isn't with the movie. Now, I want to talk about something that's got me particularly intrigued: the structure of the film's ending. Because a war movie's ending is crucial. It's the moment where the conflicts raised during the previous 2 hours get resolved, or don't. It's where the viewer gets, or doesn't get, an answer to the questions the film has posed. And it's where the film's legacy gets defined, or doesn't. From what's leaked, War Machine's ending is neither triumphalist nor defeatist. It's not that victory scene with the flag waving in the wind and epic music in the background, but it's also not an apocalyptic finale where everything is lost. It's something more ambiguous, more nuanced, more real. It's an ending that leaves you thinking, that doesn't give you a clean, satisfying resolution, because the reality of war doesn't offer clean, satisfying resolutions. And I know that might frustrate some viewers. There are people who want a movie to clearly tell them who won and who lost, who was right and who was wrong. But those clear answers are a fantasy, especially when we're talking about modern warfare. Reality is ambiguous, messy, contradictory, and an ending that reflects that reality, though less emotionally satisfying, is more honest and, in the long run, more impactful. I've been told there's a final shot in the film that's particularly powerful. Without revealing what it is, they say it's an image that visually summarizes everything the movie has tried to say during its nearly 3-hour runtime. It's an image that stays with you, that haunts you, that comes back to your mind days after watching the film. And if that's true, then War Machine will have achieved something very few films manage, creating a cinematic moment that transcends the screen and lodges itself in the viewer's consciousness. But hey, all of this is speculation based on leaks and early impressions. The real test will be when the movie releases and each of us can judge it for ourselves. And that's the exciting part of being a film fan. The anticipation, the hope, the possibility that what you're about to see might change your perspective, move you, challenge you, make you feel something you hadn't felt before. Now let me shift focus a bit and discuss the competition, because War Machine isn't going to exist in a vacuum. It's releasing into a cinematic landscape full of other productions competing for audience attention. And I think it's relevant to analyze what other war films or similar themed projects are in production or planned for the same period. The truth is, the war genre is experiencing a kind of renaissance. After some years where war movies seem to have lost some traction at the box office and on platforms, the industry seems to have rediscovered the genre's potential. There are several big-budget war productions on the way, some set in historical conflicts and others in contemporary or futuristic scenarios. And that means War Machine is going to have to stand out in an increasingly competitive field. But competition isn't necessarily a bad thing. On the contrary, when there are several good films from the same genre competing for audience attention, the result is usually that the overall level rises. Filmmakers work harder, take more risks, look for more original angles, and that benefits the viewer, who ends up having more quality options to choose from. That said, I think War Machine has enough of its own personality to stand out from the competition. Its focus on the bureaucratic machinery of war, its tone that mixes satire and drama, its commitment to authenticity, its first-rate cast. All of that distinguishes it from other war productions that opt for a more conventional approach. It's not simply another war movie. It's a film that uses war as a lens to examine broader themes about power, bureaucracy, politics, and the human condition. And speaking of the human condition, I want to dedicate a moment to discussing a theme that War Machine apparently touches on significantly: the human cost of war for those who fight it. I don't mean just physical casualties, the dead, the wounded, but the psychological, emotional, and social toll that war takes on military personnel and their families. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance abuse, difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, family problems, veteran suicide. These are issues society has started to recognize and address, but which are still surrounded by stigma and silence. And cinema has an important role in breaking that silence, in humanizing statistics, in putting a face and name to problems often discussed in the abstract. War Machine, from what's known, doesn't limit itself to showing war itself. It also shows what comes after. There are scenes that show soldiers struggling with the psychological aftermath of combat, with the inability to return to a normal life after experiencing the abnormal. And those scenes, they say, are among the most moving in the entire film, not because they're sensationalistic or manipulative, but because they're honest and respectful toward a reality too many people know firsthand. And that, to me, is cinema with purpose. It's cinema that doesn't just entertain, but educates, sensitizes, generates empathy. If after watching War Machine, a single person has a deeper understanding of what war veterans face, then the film will have justified its existence beyond any measure of commercial or critical success. Well, we've been at this for a while, and I still haven't talked about something I think is crucial: the ethics of making war movies as entertainment. Because there's an inherent tension in the war genre. On one hand, we want to tell important stories about war. On the other hand, we're turning human suffering into a consumer product. And that tension doesn't have an easy resolution. Is it ethically acceptable to enjoy a war movie? Are we trivializing real suffering when we get excited by a fictional combat sequence? Or are we, through fiction, accessing a deeper understanding of realities that would otherwise be inaccessible to most people? These are difficult questions, and the answer largely depends on the film's intention and execution. A movie that glorifies violence without showing its consequences, that presents war as an exciting adventure with no human cost, that reduces combatants to one-dimensional caricatures. That film does have an ethical problem, but a movie that approaches war with honesty, that shows both the adrenaline of combat and the horror of its consequences, that presents its characters as complex human beings rather than cardboard heroes or villains. That film is doing something valuable, something necessary. And from everything we know about War Machine, it seems to fall firmly in the second category. It doesn't glorify war. It examines it. It doesn't celebrate violence. It shows its costs. It doesn't simplify reality. It complicates it in productive ways. And that gives me confidence we're looking at a film that will not only be entertaining, but ethically sound. Now, I want to address something I know many are thinking, but few say out loud. Is War Machine an anti-American movie? Because every time a film questions a country's military policy, accusations of lack of patriotism appear. And I know with War Machine, those accusations are going to pour in. But here's the thing. Questioning a government's decisions isn't the same as being unpatriotic. In fact, you could argue that questioning those in power is one of the most patriotic acts there is, because it implies a commitment to the values a nation should represent, not to the people or institutions that circumstantially govern it. The best democracies are those that allow and encourage questioning of authority. And the best war movies are those that dare to ask whether the wars we fight are truly necessary, whether we're fighting them well, whether the sacrifices we demand are proportional to the objectives we pursue. War Machine isn't unpatriotic for questioning the military machine. It's profoundly patriotic, in the most genuine sense of the word, because it cares enough about its country and its citizens to tell the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. And if someone confuses honesty with disloyalty, that says more about that person than about the movie. All right, I think it's time to talk about another aspect of the production that I find fascinating, the casting process. Because choosing the right actors for a war movie is an incredibly delicate task. You need actors who are believable in military roles, who have the physical presence and authority to convince you they're soldiers, generals, officers. But you also need actors who can convey the vulnerability, the doubt, the fear, the humanity that exists behind the uniform. In War Machine, the casting appears to have been an extensive and meticulous process. The lead actors went through a preparation process that included not just reading the script, but weeks of basic military training, consultations with veterans, immersion in the world they were going to represent. It's not the same acting as a soldier if you've never felt the weight of body armor or the suffocating heat inside an armored vehicle. That physical experience informs the performance in ways that can't be faked, and War Machine's actors seem to have done that preliminary work seriously. Additionally, the casting included hiring local actors for the roles of civilians and enemy combatants. That's a decision that isn't always made in Hollywood, where actors of a vaguely similar ethnicity are often hired and asked to fake an accent or speak a language that isn't theirs. War Machine avoids that problem by hiring actors who genuinely belong to the cultures they represent, which gives the film an additional layer of authenticity that audiences, though they might not consciously identify it, definitely feel. Now, I want to talk about a production detail I find particularly interesting: the decision to film in chronological order. Most movies aren't filmed in the order they'll be watched. They're shot according to logistical convenience, grouping scenes that happen in the same location or require the same actors, regardless of their position in the narrative. But War Machine, according to reports, was filmed largely in chronological order, allowing actors to naturally live the evolution of their characters. That decision has significant logistical costs. It forces you to keep locations and actors available for longer, but the narrative benefits are enormous. The actors can feel how their characters change throughout the story, can build on what they've done in previous scenes, can arrive at the final scenes with all the emotional weight of what they've experienced during filming, and that shows on screen. Believe me, there's an organic progression in the performances that's hard to achieve when you film the final scene in the first week of shooting and the opening scene in the last. It's a luxury not every production can afford, but that Netflix was apparently willing to finance, and that tells me the platform believed and believes in this project enough to give the filmmakers the freedom and resources necessary to do it the right way, not the cheapest or fastest way. Let's move on to a topic I think is relevant but rarely discussed: the film's accessibility for international audiences. War Machine is an English-language production, yes, but Netflix operates in more than 190 countries, and most of its subscribers aren't English speakers. So the film's success depends largely on how well it works in other markets, with other languages, with other cultural contexts. Dubbing and subtitling are crucial factors here. A bad dub can ruin a movie. Poor subtitles can cause important nuances to be lost. And Netflix has improved significantly in this area in recent years, investing in quality dubs and translations that capture not just the literal meaning of dialogue, but also its tone and cultural nuances. For War Machine, where dialogue is particularly important, the quality of localization can make the difference between a complete cinematic experience and an impoverished version of what the filmmakers intended to create. Another aspect of international accessibility is the content itself. War movies can be a sensitive topic in certain countries, especially those that have been the scene of recent conflicts or have a complicated relationship with military history. Netflix will have to be careful about how it positions the film in different markets, ensuring the marketing is appropriate for each cultural context without diluting the film's message. And speaking of message, I want to delve a bit deeper into what I believe is War Machine's central message, because every great film has something to say, a central idea around which the entire narrative is built. And War Machine's message, from what I can interpret, is something like this: the institutions we create to solve problems often become part of the problem, and the people within those institutions, however well-intentioned, are limited by the structures surrounding them. It's a message that transcends war. It could apply to any large organization, a government, a corporation, an educational system, a healthcare system. The idea that individual good intentions can be neutralized by institutional dynamics is something that resonates across many areas of life. And that's what gives War Machine a universality that goes beyond the war genre. It's not just a movie about war, it's a movie about how the systems we build end up controlling us rather than us controlling them. And that message, by the way, is particularly relevant in today's world. We live in an era of institutional crisis, where trust in large organizations, governments, militaries, corporations, media, is at historic lows. People feel that institutions don't work, that they're more concerned with their own survival than with serving the people they're supposed to serve. And War Machine, by examining that dysfunction in the context of war, is touching a nerve that goes far beyond the military. Now, I don't want to give the impression that War Machine is a political science lecture disguised as a movie. It's not. First and foremost, it's a story, a narrative with characters who live, suffer, laugh, and make decisions. The deep themes are there, yes, but they're woven into the plot organically, not as speeches or sermons. The filmmakers understand that the best way to convey a message is through emotion, not argumentation. And that's why, according to those who've seen early material, War Machine works both as entertainment and as reflection. But enough about deep themes. Let's talk about something lighter. Audience expectations. How many people are going to watch War Machine when it drops on Netflix? That's a hard question to answer, because Netflix is famously opaque with its audience data. But we can make some estimates based on the performance of similar films on the platform. All Quiet on the Western Front accumulated more than 150 million viewing hours in its first weeks on Netflix. The Gray Man surpassed 250 million hours. Glass Onion reached over 200 million. If War Machine achieved similar numbers, we'd be talking about one of Netflix's most watched films of the year. And given the caliber of the production, the relevance of the topic, and the likely aggressive marketing campaign, I think it's a real possibility. But numbers aren't everything. Netflix also measures the cultural impact of its productions, how much they're talked about on social media, how many reviews they generate, how many debates they provoke. And in that sense, War Machine has all the ingredients to be a cultural phenomenon, a controversial topic, a stellar cast, exceptional production quality, and a historical moment that gives it additional relevance. Well, let's talk now about something I think is important and often overlooked: the experience of watching the movie. I don't mean the story or the technique, but the practical experience of sitting down to watch a nearly 3-hour film at home. Because, let's be honest, watching a long movie at home is a fundamentally different experience from watching it in a theater. In a theater, you're captive. The room is dark, the phone is silenced, there are no distractions. At home, distractions are infinite. The phone, the dog, the kids, the fridge, the temptation to pause and continue another day. And that's a real challenge for any long-duration streaming film. War Machine needs to be engaging enough to keep the viewer glued to the screen for 3 hours, despite all the distractions around them. And that means every scene has to justify its existence. There can't be unnecessary dead time. The pacing has to be impeccable. Netflix knows this and has probably worked with the filmmakers to ensure the final version has that "I can't stop watching" quality. They may have even suggested or demanded editing adjustments to maintain a rhythm that works in the home environment. It's one of the tensions of streaming cinema: the director's artistic vision versus the platform's practical demands. And how that tension is resolved in the case of War Machine could be determinant for the viewer's experience. Personally, my recommendation for when the movie releases is Turn off the phone, turn off the lights, put on good headphones if you don't have a good sound system, and immerse yourself completely. War Machine seems to be the kind of film that rewards full attention, where details matter, where what's said between the lines is as important as what's said explicitly. It's a movie to watch with all five senses, not with one eye on the screen and the other on your phone. And while we're making recommendations, let me suggest something. Before watching War Machine, watch or revisit some of the films that probably inspired it. Watch Apocalypse Now to understand the tradition of critical war cinema. Watch Dr. Strangelove to appreciate how humor can be a vehicle for the sharpest political critique. Watch The Fog of War to understand the complexities of military decision-making. And watch All Quiet on the Western Front, the Netflix version, to see what the platform can achieve when it bets big on the war genre. Those films aren't prerequisites for enjoying War Machine, but they do provide context that enriches the experience. They let you appreciate what War Machine does differently, what it borrows from its predecessors, and what it brings new to the genre. And that, for any cinephile, is part of the pleasure of watching movies, understanding how each film exists in conversation with those that came before. All right, let's talk about something that's got me intrigued, the role of social media in the film's reception. Because we live in an era where first impressions of a movie go viral in minutes, where a tweet or TikTok video can determine whether people will watch a film or not. And War Machine, with its controversial themes and provocative approach, is destined to generate strong reactions on social media. I'm already imagining the Twitter debates. It's the best war movie I've ever seen, versus it's propaganda disguised as cinema, versus the ending destroyed me, versus the ending makes no sense. And all of that's going to happen in the first hours after release, before most people have had time to watch it and form their own opinion. It's an interesting and somewhat frustrating phenomenon. On one hand, social media democratizes film criticism, allowing anyone to share their opinion without needing to be a professional critic. On the other hand, the immediacy and superficiality of social media can distort a film's perception, turning a complex and nuanced work into a series of hot takes and binaries. It's good or it's bad. I agree or I disagree, with no room for reflection or nuance. My advice is, when War Machine releases, watch it before reading opinions. Form your own impression. Allow yourself to feel what the movie makes you feel without the interference of what others say you should feel. And then, if you want, dive into the online debates. But do it from a position of your own knowledge, not external influence. Now, I want to dedicate a moment to talking about something I think is fundamental: War Machine's relevance for younger generations. Because there's an entire generation of people who've grown up in a world where war is a constant but an abstraction. They see the news, read the headlines, maybe follow some conflict on social media, but the reality of war is something distant, something that happens to others, in places they can't locate on a map. For that generation, War Machine could be a gateway to a deeper understanding of what war means. Not an intellectual understanding that can be obtained by reading books or watching documentaries, but an emotional, visceral understanding that only narrative cinema can provide. Because when you see a character on screen make a decision that will cost lives, when you see the consequences of that decision unfold before your eyes, when you feel the tension, the fear, the confusion, the rage, that creates an emotional connection to the subject that no newspaper article can replicate. And that emotional connection is the first step toward empathy, toward understanding, toward commitment. If War Machine makes a 20-year-old wonder for the first time what it feels like to be in a war zone, if it makes them question the simplistic narratives governments use to justify conflicts, if it makes them feel some empathy for the people, soldiers and civilians, who live with the consequences of decisions made by people who never set foot on the battlefield, then the film will have achieved something profoundly valuable. But I don't want to sound too idealistic. I'm realistic, and I know that a movie, however good it is, isn't going to change the world. Wars aren't going to stop existing because Netflix releases a film that questions them. But art has cumulative power. Every movie, every book, every song that addresses a difficult subject honestly contributes grain by grain to changing how society thinks about that subject. And War Machine can be one more grain in that process, a significant grain if the film is as good as it promises. Let's get back to the concrete. I want to talk about a couple of specific scenes that, according to leaks, are particularly memorable. I already mentioned the ambushed convoy scene, but there are others that deserve discussion. One of them is an interrogation scene. I won't give details about who interrogates whom or in what context, but they say it's a scene that simmers slowly, with tension gradually building to a breaking point that leaves you speechless. The performances in this scene are, according to first impressions, extraordinary. There's a verbal dance between the two characters involved, a game of power and manipulation that unfolds through glances, silences, carefully chosen words. It's the kind of scene that proves you don't need explosions to create tension. Sometimes, two people sitting face to face in a closed room can generate more adrenaline than all the action in the world. Another scene that's been repeatedly mentioned is one involving an unexpected moment of humanity between people from opposing sides. Without revealing details, it's a scene where conflict is momentarily suspended and the people behind the uniforms, or the weapons, recognize each other as human beings. It's a brief, fragile moment that could break at any second. And that fragility is what makes it so powerful. The idea that even in the midst of war, humanity can find cracks to seep through. These moments are what define a great war movie. It's not the big battles or spectacular explosions, though those have their place too, but those instances of human connection that remind us that, in the end, war is between people, not between armies or ideologies. And if War Machine is full of those moments, as early impressions suggest, then we're looking at something truly special. Now, I want to talk about a topic that's a bit meta, but I think is relevant: the relationship between war movies and the military industry. Because there's a long history of collaboration between Hollywood and the Pentagon, where the military provides equipment, advisors, and logistical support in exchange for influence over the script. It's a relationship that has produced some interesting films, but that also raises serious questions about artistic independence and propaganda. War Machine, from what's known, hasn't received official military support, which isn't surprising given its critical approach. And that, paradoxically, can be an advantage. Without pressure from a military patron, filmmakers have total freedom to tell the story however they want, without worrying about whether the Pentagon approves of their portrayal of the armed forces. It's independent cinema in the best sense, free from external interference, guided only by artistic vision and the pursuit of truth. But that independence also has a cost. Without military support, the production had to get its own equipment, build its own sets, hire its own advisors. All of that costs money and time, and you can't always replicate the level of authenticity that access to real military resources provides. However, from what's been seen, War Machine has achieved an impressive level of realism without needing that institutional support, which speaks well of the production team's dedication and creativity. All right, I think it's time to start wrapping up this discussion, though honestly, I could keep talking about War Machine for hours. There are so many aspects to discuss, so many angles to explore, so many questions to raise. But the truth is, most of those questions can only be answered when the movie releases, and we can all watch it. What I can say, based on everything we've discussed, is that War Machine has all the ingredients to be one of the most important films of 2026. Not just as entertainment, not just as visual spectacle, but as a work of art that questions, provokes, challenges our assumptions about war, politics, power, and human nature. If it delivers on its promise, it could be one of those films that become a reference, that people keep discussing years after its release, that get included on lists of the best films of their genre. But I'm also aware that high expectations can be a curse. The more you expect from a movie, the easier it is to be disappointed. So my advice is, keep the enthusiasm, but don't turn it into inflated expectations. Go watch War Machine with an open mind, willing to be surprised, willing to accept that the movie might not be what you expected and still be something valuable. Because the best cinema is what takes you places you didn't expect to go, that shows you things you didn't expect to see, that makes you feel things you didn't expect to feel. And speaking of feeling unexpected things, I want to share something personal. When I started researching War Machine to prepare this content, I expected to find just another war movie from the pile, another big Netflix production with explosions, famous actors, and a predictable message. But as I dug deeper into the production details, the themes it addresses, the approach it takes, the creative decisions that have been made, I started changing my mind. I went from skepticism to curiosity, from curiosity to interest, from interest to genuine enthusiasm. And that doesn't happen with just any movie, believe me. I'm not saying War Machine is going to be perfect. No movie is. It'll surely have flaws. A character that's not well developed, a scene that drags too long, a narrative twist that doesn't quite work. But if the successes are as significant as early impressions suggest, the flaws will be easily forgivable. Great movies aren't perfect. They're imperfect in ways that don't matter, because what they do well is so powerful, it eclipses everything else. So, yeah, I'm excited about War Machine. I'm excited to see how it handles its themes, how it develops its characters, how it balances action with reflection, how it makes us feel. I'm excited for the discussions it's going to generate, the debates it's going to provoke, the questions it's going to raise. And I'm excited to share that experience with all of you, to analyze it together, to discuss what works and what doesn't, to try to understand what the movie is trying to say and whether it succeeds. But before finishing, I want to leave you with a reflection I think is pertinent. War is probably the human activity that best summarizes our contradictions as a species. We're capable of unimaginable cruelty and at the same time of extraordinary courage and compassion. We destroy and we rebuild. We kill and we heal. We hate and we love, sometimes the same people, sometimes at the same moment. And the best war movies capture those contradictions, reflect them back to us like a mirror where we don't always like what we see. If War Machine manages to be that mirror, if it manages to show us our contradictions without judging us, but also without forgiving us, if it manages to make us uncomfortable in productive ways, then it will have achieved something very few films accomplish. And that, regardless of audience numbers, awards, or reviews, will be an achievement worth celebrating. Now, I want to revisit something I mentioned earlier, but that deserves deeper exploration. The relationship between the protagonist and his team. Because in every war movie, the dynamic within the group is fundamental. It doesn't matter if we're talking about an infantry platoon or a general staff. Interpersonal relationships within the group are the emotional heart of the story. And in War Machine, those relationships appear to be particularly rich and complex. The protagonist, that general who arrives with a clear mission and apparently unshakable confidence, has around him a team of subordinates who follow him with varying degrees of loyalty, skepticism, and personal motivation. There are those who genuinely believe in his vision and are willing to follow him to the end. There are those who have doubts but keep them quiet out of discipline or convenience. And there are those who openly question his decisions but keep obeying because that's how the chain of command works. This diversity of attitudes within the team creates an internal tension that's fascinating to observe. Because it's not a tension that explodes all at once. It's a tension that accumulates slowly, like a pressure cooker. Every decision the general makes, every order he gives, every time reality contradicts his plans, the pressure increases a little more. And the viewer can feel that growing pressure, can anticipate that at some point something's going to give. The question isn't whether the pot will blow, it's when and how. Within the team, there's one character I find particularly interesting, the civilian advisor accompanying the general. This character comes from the political world, not the military, and his presence on the team is a constant source of friction. The military see him as an intruder, someone who doesn't understand ground realities and is there to watch them more than help them. And he, for his part, sees the military as tactically competent, but blind to the political and diplomatic implications of their actions. The tension between this civilian advisor and the team's military establishment is one of the most interesting narrative threads of the movie, according to leaks, because it represents in miniature the broader tension between the military and political spheres that defines how modern wars are fought. Who should make the decisions? The military, who understand the battlefield, or the politicians, who understand diplomatic consequences? Can a general act according to his professional judgment when every decision has political ramifications? Can a politician understand the urgency of combat from the safety of their office? These are questions without easy answers, and War Machine poses them through daily interactions between these characters. Not as abstract debates, but as personal conflicts, as daily friction, as moments of frustration, and occasionally mutual understanding. And that's first-rate storytelling, taking big geopolitical questions and turning them into human drama. Another secondary character worth attention is the young soldier on his first deployment. This character functions, as I mentioned earlier, as a stand-in for the viewer. He sees everything with fresh eyes, asks the questions we would ask, is surprised by the things that would surprise us. But as the story progresses, his perspective changes. The initial innocence gives way to a deeper and darker understanding of what war means. And that transformation, that loss of innocence, is one of the most powerful narrative arcs in war cinema. What makes this character special in War Machine is that his transformation isn't simply a narrative trope. It's grounded in specific experiences that the film takes time to develop. He doesn't go from being a rookie to a hardened veteran overnight. The change is gradual, cumulative, the result of a series of experiences that erode his idealistic worldview. And when we finally accept that he's changed, when we see in his eyes that he's no longer the same person he was at the beginning of the film, the emotional impact is devastating. And that's one of war's greatest costs, a cost that rarely appears in official balance sheets, the loss of innocence. Young people who go to war carry with them a worldview that, for better or worse, will be fundamentally altered by the experience, and many of them never recover what they lose in the process. War Machine seems to understand that and shows it with a sensitivity that's not common in the genre. Well, I want to change register and talk about something more technical, the film's editing, because editing is an aspect of cinema that general audiences rarely notice when it's well done, but that's absolutely crucial to the final result. A good editor can save a mediocre movie, and a bad editor can ruin an excellent film. It's the invisible work that holds the entire narrative structure together. In War Machine, editing seems to be one of the production's strong points. The editor they've chosen has experience in films that combine action with drama, that alternate between high-intensity sequences and moments of reflective calm. And that's exactly the kind of skill War Machine needs. The ability to cut between a frenetic combat scene and an intimate dialogue without the change feeling forced. The ability to control the narrative rhythm so each moment has exactly the duration it needs, no more, no less. There's a concept in film editing called the invisible cut. It's when cuts between shots are so natural, so organic, that the viewer doesn't notice them. You're not conscious of having moved from one shot to another. The story simply flows. And when that's achieved, the viewer's experience is infinitely more immersive than when the cuts are evident or clumsy. From what's been said about War Machine, the editing tends toward that ideal of invisibility, allowing the story to flow without technical interruptions. But there are moments where the editing becomes deliberately visible, where cuts are abrupt and disorienting, and that's not a mistake, it's an artistic choice. In combat or crisis scenes, the editing fragments. Shots are shorter, cuts more jarring, recreating the disorientation and confusion of the moment. It's a technique that, when used in moderation, can be extraordinarily effective for conveying to the viewer the subjective experience of being in a chaotic situation. The contrast between the smooth editing of calm scenes and the fragmented editing of tense scenes creates a visual rhythm that reflects the emotional rhythm of the story. It's like a symphony where slow movements give way to allegros, where calm and storm alternate in ways that make each highlight the other. And that kind of sophistication in editing is a sign we're looking at a production where every technical aspect has been carefully considered. Let's return now to the film's themes, because there's one I still haven't addressed with the depth it deserves: the relationship between media and war. In the information age, media coverage of a conflict can be as influential as military operations themselves. The images we see on the news, the stories journalists tell us, the headlines we read online, all of that shapes our perception of the conflict and, by extension, the public support governments need to sustain their military operations. War Machine addresses this theme from several angles. There are journalist characters who try to cover the conflict honestly, but face constant obstacles: restricted access, filtered information, pressure from their editors, the temptation to simplify a complex reality to fit news format. And there are military characters who see the media as a tool they can manipulate to serve their purposes, controlling what information goes public and how it's presented. This war within the war, the battle for the narrative, is one of the most contemporary aspects of the film. In a world where fake news, disinformation, and propaganda are weapons as powerful as missiles, the question of who controls information is more relevant than ever. And War Machine doesn't limit itself to raising the question. It explores it in depth, showing how media manipulation can have real consequences on the battlefield and in the lives of people affected by the conflict. There's a scene, according to leaks, where a journalist discovers information that contradicts the operation's official narrative. What follows is an ethical dilemma. Do they publish the information and risk their access to the front, or do they stay silent and become complicit in a lie? It's a dilemma real journalists face all the time in conflict zones, and the way the film handles it is reportedly one of the script's finest achievements. This brings me to another point: the responsibility of cinema to history. When a movie draws inspiration from real events, even if it's not a direct adaptation, it has a responsibility to the people who lived through those events. It can't distort reality to the point of being misleading, but it also can't limit itself to being a documentary reconstruction. It has to find a balance between historical truth and emotional truth, between what happened and what it felt like. And that's an extremely delicate balance that not every film manages. From what's known about War Machine, the film handles this balance carefully. It doesn't claim to be a literal representation of any specific conflict, but it draws from multiple real conflicts to create a story that feels authentic and relevant. The filmmakers have spoken in interviews about their responsibility to be honest about the reality of war without falling into propaganda for any side. And that commitment to honesty, if maintained throughout the film, is what can make War Machine something truly significant. So there you have it, folks. Everything we know so far about what could potentially be one of the defining war films of this decade. Whether it lives up to the massive expectations building around it, only time will tell. But based on everything we've broken down today, the talent involved, the approach they're taking, the themes they're exploring, I'd say we've got plenty of reasons to mark our calendars and clear our schedules for when this thing finally drops. Until then, keep the conversation going. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one. All right, But before we actually wrap things up, there's something else I've been thinking about that I really want to dig into, because we've covered a lot of ground here. The technical stuff, the thematic stuff, the behind-the-scenes drama, but there's one element we haven't really explored yet that I think could make or break this whole thing: the pacing of information revelation throughout the film. See, one of the trickiest things about making a war movie that deals with bureaucracy and politics is figuring out how much the audience needs to know at any given moment. Too much information too early, and you overwhelm people, you lose them in a sea of acronyms and military terminology and political maneuvering. Too little, and they're confused, disconnected, unable to follow the stakes of what's happening. It's like walking a tightrope while juggling flaming torches and someone's throwing water balloons at you from the sidelines. From what's been leaked about War Machine, the screenwriters seem to have cracked this particular nut. They've structured the information flow in a way that mirrors the protagonist's own journey of discovery. At the beginning, we know what he knows, which is to say, we have the official briefings, the sanitized reports, the optimistic projections. As the film progresses and he starts digging deeper, peeling back layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, we discover things alongside him. And that shared journey of discovery creates a bond between audience and protagonist that pure exposition could never achieve. There's apparently this recurring motif in the film where different characters present completely different versions of the same situation. The general sees it one way, his intelligence officer sees it another, the civilian advisor has a third interpretation, and the boots on the ground have yet another perspective entirely. And the genius move, if the execution matches the concept, is that none of these perspectives are presented as definitively correct. The film trusts the audience to hold multiple contradictory viewpoints simultaneously and to sit with that discomfort rather than demanding a simple resolution. That approach reminds me of what Rashomon did back in 1950, presenting the same event from multiple perspectives and refusing to tell the audience which one was true. But War Machine apparently takes that concept and applies it not to a single event, but to an entire military campaign. What does victory look like? Depends on who you ask. Are we winning? The answer changes based on which office you're sitting in. It's the kind of narrative sophistication that we don't often see in mainstream war films, and I'm genuinely curious to see if they pull it off. Another thing that's been bouncing around in my head is the role of technology not just as a thematic element, but as a visual storytelling device. Modern warfare is increasingly mediated through screens, drone feeds, satellite imagery, thermal cameras, digital communications, and War Machine apparently makes extensive use of these technological interfaces as a visual language, showing us the war as the commanders see it, abstracted, pixelated, removed from physical reality. But then the film cuts to the ground level, to the flesh and blood reality that those digital abstractions represent. And the contrast is jarring in the best possible way. It's like those moments in video games when you suddenly realize that the dots you've been clicking on are supposed to be people. That cognitive dissonance, that gap between representation and reality, is apparently one of the film's most powerful tools for making its point about the dehumanizing nature of modern warfare. And speaking of visual language, I've heard some interesting things about the color grading choices in different sections of the film. The scenes set in operations centers and government buildings apparently have this cold, almost sterile blue tint, clinical, detached, institutional. The scenes in the field have warmer, harsher colors, the yellows and oranges of the desert sun, the reds of dust and blood, and the scenes that deal with the personal lives of the characters, the rare moments of domesticity and human connection, have a softer, more naturalistic palette. It's not subtle, sure, but it doesn't need to be. The color coding creates an immediate, almost subconscious association between location and emotional register. When you see that blue tint, your brain automatically shifts into bureaucracy mode. When you see the warm yellows, you brace yourself for action or danger. It's visual shorthand that allows the film to move between radically different settings without losing narrative momentum. Now, I want to talk about something that's been nagging at me, the question of audience sympathy, because War Machine is apparently trying to do something very tricky. It wants us to understand and even sympathize with characters whose decisions lead to terrible outcomes. The general isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He's a true believer, someone who genuinely thinks he's doing the right thing. And the film doesn't let us off the hook by making him obviously wrong or obviously evil. That's a risky narrative choice. Audiences generally want clear moral guideposts, someone to root for, someone to root against. When a film refuses to provide those guideposts, it can feel frustrating or even morally irresponsible. Are you saying we should sympathize with warmongers? I can already see the Twitter threads forming, but here's the thing. Understanding is not the same as endorsing. And the best dramatic art has always been about understanding, about getting inside the heads of people whose choices we might find reprehensible in real life. Shakespeare didn't endorse Macbeth's murders, but he damn sure made us understand why Macbeth made the choices he made, and War Machine seems to be operating in that tradition, showing us the human reasoning behind decisions that, from an outside perspective, might seem monstrous. The key, according to those who've seen early footage, is that the film never loses sight of the consequences. It doesn't just show us the general's perspective, it shows us the ripple effects of his decisions on people who never asked to be part of his strategic calculations. The civilian caught in the crossfire, the soldier following orders they don't understand, the family back home waiting for news that may never come. By maintaining that dual focus, the decision-makers and the people affected by those decisions, the film earns the right to humanize its morally ambiguous protagonist without excusing his choices. Let me pivot to something more concrete, the action sequences. Because I know some of you are thinking, yeah, themes and moral complexity, but what about the explosions? And look, I get it. War movies need to deliver on the visceral level too, not just the intellectual one. You can have all the sophisticated political commentary in the world, but if the combat scenes are boring or poorly executed, you've lost a significant portion of your audience. The good news is that War Machine apparently delivers in this department. The action sequences have been described as tense, chaotic, and grounded in a way that makes them feel genuinely dangerous rather than glamorized. There's no slow-motion hero shots, no one-man army nonsense, no clean victories where our side emerges unscathed. Combat in this film is messy, confusing, and terrifying, which, from what I understand, is much closer to what actual combat is like than most Hollywood depictions. There's one sequence in particular that's been getting a lot of buzz, a nighttime operation that goes sideways in the worst possible way. Without spoiling the specifics, it apparently involves a catastrophic miscommunication between air support and ground forces, leading to a situation where no one knows who's shooting at whom or where the enemy actually is. The chaos is disorienting for the characters, and the filmmakers have apparently found a way to make it disorienting for the audience too, without crossing the line into incomprehensibility. What makes this sequence work, according to those who've seen it, is that it's not just chaos for chaos's sake. Every moment of confusion has a cause, every mistake has a consequence, and by the end of the sequence, you understand exactly how a series of small errors compounded into a disaster. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion. You see each contributing factor, each moment where things could have gone differently, and the cumulative effect is both horrifying and tragically inevitable. The sound design in these action sequences is apparently next-level stuff. I mentioned earlier that they recorded real weapons and equipment, but it goes beyond that. The spatial audio apparently puts you right in the middle of the action, with bullets whizzing past in specific directions, explosions creating that distinctive pressure change effect, voices cutting in and out as radio communications fail and succeed. If you've got a good surround sound setup, or even just decent headphones, these sequences are supposedly immersive in a way that makes you flinch. But here's what I really appreciate. The film apparently doesn't use action as a break from the themes. Even in the middle of combat, the film is making its points about communication breakdown, about the gap between planning and reality, about the human cost of strategic decisions. The action serves the story, rather than interrupting it. That integration is rare and valuable. All right, let me talk about something that I think is going to generate a lot of debate once the film comes out. The portrayal of the enemy. In too many war movies, the opposing force is either faceless or cartoonishly evil, a horde of interchangeable bad guys whose deaths we're supposed to cheer. It's lazy storytelling, and it's also kind of gross when you think about it. These are supposed to be human beings, even if they're fighting on the other side of a conflict. War Machine apparently takes a different approach. Without turning the opposing forces into heroes or excusing their actions, the film gives them a degree of humanity that's often absent from the genre. There's a scene, from what I've heard, where we briefly see the conflict from the perspective of someone on the other side. Their fears, their motivations, their own version of patriotism or duty. It's not a long scene, just a few minutes, but its presence changes the entire texture of the film by acknowledging that the people on the other side are also people, with families, with reasons for fighting, with their own internal contradictions. The film complicates the easy moral calculus of war. It's harder to cheer for explosions when you've seen, even briefly, that the people being exploded have inner lives, and that discomfort is intentional. War Machine doesn't want you to feel good about violence. It wants you to feel the weight of it. This approach might not be for everyone. Some viewers want their war movies to provide catharsis, to let them experience the thrill of victory without having to think too hard about what that victory costs. And that's a legitimate desire. Entertainment doesn't always have to be challenging. But for viewers who want something more, who want a war movie that respects their intelligence and engages with the moral complexity of armed conflict, War Machine seems like it might be the real deal. Let's shift gears and talk about the marketing campaign for a second, because I've been noticing some interesting choices in how Netflix is positioning this film. The early promotional materials have been heavy on atmosphere and tone, but light on specific plot details. We've seen the main cast in military gear. We've seen sweeping shots of desert landscapes. We've seen glimpses of tense conversations in wood-paneled offices. But the actual narrative, who these people are, what they're trying to accomplish, what goes wrong, has been kept deliberately vague. That's a smart approach for a film like this. If you give away too much of the plot, you risk spoiling the discoveries that make the story compelling. And if you focus too heavily on the action, you risk attracting an audience that's going to be disappointed by the film's more contemplative moments. By selling the mood rather than the mechanics, Netflix is setting appropriate expectations while still generating curiosity. I've also noticed that the marketing has been emphasizing the based on real events angle, even though, as I mentioned earlier, the film isn't a direct adaptation of any specific conflict. It's inspired by real events, informed by real experiences, but it's not claiming to be a documentary. That distinction is important, and I appreciate that the marketing seems to be respecting it. Nothing worse than going into a film expecting a true story and discovering that the filmmakers took massive creative liberties. The trailer, when it eventually drops, is going to be crucial. It's going to set the tone for how the general public perceives this film. Is it a gritty war drama, a political thriller, a dark comedy, a character study? The film is apparently all of these things to varying degrees, and the trailer will have to somehow communicate that range without being confusing. It's a tall order, and I'm curious to see how they handle it. Social media buzz is already building, even without a trailer. The cast announcements alone generated significant discussion, and the production photos that have leaked have been analyzed frame by fans looking for clues about the story. That kind of organic interest is gold for a marketing campaign. It means the film is already living in people's heads, already occupying mental real estate before a single official promotional piece has been released. But there's a danger in that too. When expectations build organically, they can build in unpredictable directions. People start imagining what the film might be, constructing their own version in their heads, and that imaginary version might be very different from what the actual film delivers. Managing those expectations without crushing the enthusiasm that generated them is a delicate balance. Now, let me address something that I think doesn't get talked about enough. The experience of watching a war movie in the current global context. Because we're not watching these films in a vacuum. Many viewers will be watching War Machine while real wars are happening, real people are dying, real families are being torn apart. And that context inevitably colors the viewing experience. For some viewers, that context will make the film more powerful, a reminder that these aren't just stories, that the dynamics explored in the film are playing out right now in the real world. For other viewers, it might make the film uncomfortable in ways that go beyond the filmmaker's intentions, too close to home, too raw, too real. And for still others, it might create a weird dissonance, watching fictional suffering while being aware of actual suffering happening simultaneously. The filmmakers can't control how their work is received, but they can be thoughtful about how they present it. And from what I've heard, War Machine is very conscious of its moment, very aware that it's not just entertainment, but a statement about things that matter. Whether that awareness translates into a film that feels respectful and relevant, or one that feels exploitative and tone-deaf, will depend on execution, and that's something we won't know until we actually see the thing. Circling back to the performances, because I don't think we've given them enough attention, the lead actor reportedly delivers a career-best performance as the general, charismatic enough that you understand why people follow him, flawed enough that you see the cracks forming, vulnerable enough in key moments that you never lose sight of the human being beneath the uniform. It's a performance that requires range, comedy, drama, authority, doubt, and apparently he nails all of it. But the supporting cast is equally impressive by all accounts. The actors playing the subordinates each bring something distinct to their roles, creating an ensemble that feels like a real team rather than a collection of supporting characters. You believe these people have worked together, have developed their own dynamics and tensions and inside jokes. That kind of ensemble chemistry is hard to manufacture, and it's a testament to both the casting and the direction that it apparently exists here. Special mention has to go to the actors playing civilian roles, both the political figures back home and the local population in the conflict zone. These are roles that, in lesser films, would be afterthoughts, plot devices, rather than characters. But War Machine apparently gives them room to breathe, to be fully realized human beings with their own agendas and concerns. The result is a film that feels populated rather than staged, lived in rather than constructed. There's been some discussion about one particular performance that's being kept under wraps. A character who apparently doesn't appear until late in the film, but whose presence shifts the entire dynamic. I won't speculate about who this might be or what role they play, but the secrecy around this character suggests that their appearance is meant to be a significant moment. Whether it's a surprise cameo or a narrative twist, we'll have to wait and see. Let me talk for a moment about the film's relationship to other recent war movies, because War Machine isn't arriving in a vacuum. The success of 1917, Dunkirk, and Netflix's own All Quiet on the Western Front has created a renewed appetite for serious, cinematically ambitious war films. But it's also raised the bar for what audiences expect. You can't just slap some military uniforms on actors and call it a war movie anymore. People want craftsmanship. They want vision. They want something that justifies the genre's existence. War Machine seems to understand this context and has positioned itself accordingly. It's not trying to compete directly with those other films. It's not a historical epic, not a survival story, not a traditional combat narrative. Instead, it's carved out its own niche, focusing on the institutional and political dimensions of warfare that those other films touched on, but didn't explore in depth. It's complementary rather than competitive, filling a gap in the recent war movie landscape rather than treading the same ground. That said, comparisons are inevitable. Critics and audiences alike will measure War Machine against its predecessors, looking for points of connection and divergence. How does its combat photography compare to 1917's famous tracking shots? How does its treatment of trauma compare to The Hurt Locker's psychological intensity? How does its political commentary compare to Apocalypse Now's surrealist critique? These comparisons might not be fair. Every film should be judged on its own terms, but they're unavoidable, and War Machine will have to hold its own. One thing that might work in the film's favor is its contemporary setting. Most of the acclaimed war films of recent years have dealt with historical conflicts: World War I, World War II, Vietnam. War Machine is set in a more recent time frame, dealing with the kinds of conflicts that dominate current headlines. That contemporaneity gives it a relevance that historical films, however well made, can't quite match. When you watch War Machine, you're not just watching history. You're watching something that comments directly on the present, but contemporary settings also come with risks. Historical distance allows for a certain perspective, a certain clarity about who was right and who was wrong. Contemporary conflicts are messier. The debates are ongoing. The wounds are fresh. The implications are still being worked out. War Machine enters that contested terrain and takes positions that some viewers will find controversial. That's brave, but it's also risky. The film could end up feeling dated very quickly if the real-world situations it references change significantly. All right, I think we've covered pretty much every angle I can think of. But before we actually call it, let me share some final thoughts on what War Machine represents for the future of cinema. Not just war cinema, but cinema as a whole. We're in an interesting moment for movies. Theatrical releases are still happening, but they're increasingly dominated by franchise films and guaranteed crowd pleasers. The mid-budget adult drama, the kind of film that used to be Hollywood's bread and butter, has largely migrated to streaming platforms. And that migration has created both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity is that films like War Machine can exist at all. A serious, 3-hour war film with political themes and moral ambiguity would be a tough sell for theatrical distribution in 2026. But on Netflix, it has a home.